Good evening. It is 6:33 on Tuesday, January 11th. So I'm going to call the virtual study session of the Littleton City Council to order here. I believe we have all council members present. And we have one item to discuss tonight. We're looking at ID 2208. This is a discussion and presentation with the Housing Task Force, along with their consultant, Root Policy, kind of looking over some recommendations regarding housing recommendations based on the housing study from 2017. So this is just another kind of step, another part of the conversation regarding housing in Littleton here. You know, we're not going to decide anything tonight, but this is just get some feedback of what this group has been talking about, and hopefully we can have some good discussion amongst us and with the guests who will be appearing in a little bit here. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark so we can get the presentation discussion going.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. Just to add to what the mayor was sharing here, we as staff deliberately scheduled this briefing here from the Housing Task Force in advance of your retreat here in the middle of February. As you know, one of your goals is to take on the issue of affordable housing. So we're looking forward to the discussion with council in the middle of February, trying to define exactly what that is and work towards a 2-year strategic plan and more specifically some action steps for the next couple of years. Obviously a big topic. It also has, at least in recent time, included the homeless issue. But here this evening, we have the Housing Task Force, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Kathleen Osher out of the City Manager's office. And Kathleen is going to go ahead and kind of tee this up and make some introductions. So Kathleen.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, Mayor and members of Council. We have the Housing Task Force with us as guests this evening, so I'll have them turn on their cameras now. And just a special thanks to Councilmember Milliman, who also serves as liaison to this Housing Task Force, as do I. The task force started meeting monthly in 2020, right in the midst of COVID. And we have taken on this effort with the emphasis from the comprehensive plan of really searching out partners to be able to help support work like housing and next steps. One of the key identified action steps in the comprehensive plan in the Housing and Neighborhoods chapter was to continue to have a housing task force, much as was created in 2017 to help support the housing study. And then again in 2018, when a series of recommendations came before council for adoption. So that task force has been staffed by South Metro Housing Options. So a special thanks to Corey and his staff for providing that support of the group. But this evening we have members of the task force, the chairman, Eric Veith, Emily Dykes, Bibi Kleinman, Kate Hilberg, and we have Yvonne also from South Metro Housing Options. And then later we'll be hearing from our Root Policy consultant, Molly Fitzpatrick, on some next steps with the study that council approved late last year to develop some policy direction and policy options and pathways relative to an inclusionary housing ordinance. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric Veith. He's going to share his screen. We have a short presentation, a little bit of the history of the Housing Task Force, just for newer members of council, and also an opportunity for questions at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric. Thank you.
Great. Can everyone see my screen again?
Yes.
Fantastic. So Corey is actually, I'll just reintroduce myself. I've met most of you, I think all of you. My name is Eric Veith. I'm a lifelong Littleton resident. I've been on the Housing Task Force since 2018 or 2019 and chairing it since early last year, coming up on about a 1-year anniversary since I took over from Corey. As Kathleen mentioned, our goal tonight are twofold. One, just to sort of acquaint and reacquaint people with what the task force is, why we exist, and sort of a short history. Secondly, to talk about what we've been doing and what we plan to keep on doing throughout the time of our existence. With that, I'll let Corey kind of kick it off with these first few slides and give the background context, and then I'm going to take the middle of it, and then Kate is going to cover the end, and we'll have some time for Q&A before we then switch over to Molly's presentation after hours. So with that, Corey, take it away.
All right, thank you, Eric, and good evening, council and staff. I actually want to start tonight through my SMHO lens and take this opportunity to thank council for the allocation of the CDBG funding from last week. As you know, the work we do is very challenging, very difficult. So it means a great deal to have your support from the beginning in the resolution in applying for the development with CHAFA, and then up through last week with the allocation of the funds. So thank you very much. It's greatly appreciated. And I think actually in general, it's very important to recognize all the work that's been done, all the initiatives over the last few years, and how they've impacted how we are able to address our housing goals, both now and in the future. There were huge initiatives in terms of the housing study initially in 2017 and 18, and those recommendations that came with it. The next year we had the update of the comp plan in 2019. The next year we had another housing study refresh. And then last year, the updated land use code, ULUC. So I just think a lot of credit needs to be given to both city council, city staff for putting us in a good position as a task force. It's been very impressive work in a short amount of time. So to have all these documents and these initiatives completed to help again guide us in our work is very helpful. So in terms of the task force, the formation of the task force did come out of the 2017-2018 housing study. The task force, or as it was called in the comp plan, the advisory committee, also, so that it was included in the comp plan as well in 2019. And then the newest iteration, like Kathleen mentioned, started in spring of 2020. The makeup of the current task force is very similar to what we started with in the first go around. We have representation from city council, city staff, real estate professionals, SMHO board and staff members, Littleton citizens. And just to clarify SMHO's role, while it makes sense that we are involved pretty strongly in this task force, which makes sense since we are the housing authority for the city, we also understand that it makes sense to have a variety of perspectives and expertise. And so that's kind of what we've done with this current group. And we actually have a couple of members we'll be adding very shortly. So that'll be good. In terms of our goals and objectives, which Eric will talk a little bit more in detail in a few minutes. As I mentioned earlier, the documents and the initiatives that have been completed so far really do help us and guide us through our work. And the original housing study, which is certainly one of the documents that we use as a guide, there were both short and long-term goals that were identified. So there were 5 main goal areas, and then some short-term and long-term that went with each of those 5. So those are kind of, again, what's guiding us in part, the housing study and the comprehensive plan. So I think that's it for me. And Eric, if you want to talk about the goals.
Yeah, for sure. And Corey, feel free to jump in at any time, because you definitely you've been around longer than me on this specific project in the city. So yeah, the sort of meat of this presentation that I'm going to talk about is to remind you of the goals that we are all working towards as a task force, and to try to put in perspective what we feel like has been done to achieve those goals so far, and kind of what work is left to be done out there. So as Corey mentioned, there's a list of items that were identified in the 2017 housing study and confirmed in the 2019 comp plan about what needs to be done in terms of housing policy in the city. You can see here those 5 of those main goals: adopt and articulate a vision for housing, set a goal to mitigate increases to the rental gap, consider implementing policies and programs to improve homeownership affordability, inventory vacant and underutilized parcels for residential development, and increase capacity for affordable preservation and development. So what has been done on all of those fronts so far? So first, very quickly on in our process, a year or two, starting a couple of years ago, we recognized that a lot of our challenges housing wise as a city can just be traced back to a lack of supply. It's sort of economics 101. We have a ton of demand. There are a lot of people moving to Colorado and to Denver for jobs, for lifestyle. They choose Littleton because of all the reasons that we know they choose Littleton, and there's just not enough places to put all of those people, and that drives up housing costs to people and drives a lot of people who can't afford the rising market out of our community, and in certain cases into dire situations. So the vision that we developed is a Littleton that finds creative and brave ways to expand its housing stock in the coming decades. I think if you're sort of painting a picture and talking about it more creatively, what we think of when we think of the future of Littleton is across the city looking a lot more like what our historic city center and historic neighborhoods look like. A wider variety of housing, not just single family homes, more walkable development, doubling down on that community character that we already love. And that, when a lot of people are thinking about our community character, they're pointing to a lot, our historic assets. And there's a recognition that those places within our community were developed in a very different way than we try to develop places these days. And one of the big bonuses was a greater, density of housing and a greater variety of housing in those places. And we think there's a way to replicate that elsewhere in the city. The point number 2 here, identify specific policy goals to address housing needs. There depends on how specific you get here, but one very specific or 2 very specific goals that we set forth was to reform the city zoning code, which obviously was, the task of a number of members in this calls of all of last year and years prior as well, setting the stage for that, to eventually find a way to handle affordable income restricted housing in our community for those people that can't afford market rate housing. And if you zoom out a little bit, what we're talking about there is we're looking to find ways to allow and encourage the creation of more housing so that the market supply can meet market demand. Historically, our zoning code, much like a lot of cities across the country, has put a cap on that supply and also put a lot of restrictions on what kinds of housing can be built. And we think that in order to achieve these goals of affordability and preserving our community, we think that we need to take a little bit more of a modern approach to how we zone our city and how we develop it. I think if you're, sort of a thing that I always keep in my mind as a North Star is the idea of making sure that the median home cost in our city is affordable to the median income. That's there's a lot of nuances beyond that, but that's a North Star that I keep in my mind, and increasingly the median income in our community and across the metro area cannot afford the price of a median home. The number 3, consider implementing policies and programs to improve home ownership affordability is very much sort of another side of that same coin. We spent a lot of time last year, as I mentioned, advising on the ULUC. We view zoning policy as one of the most powerful tools in housing policy. And obviously last year was a huge effort to modernize our zoning code so that we could find ways to create new and different kinds of housing within our community. And we reached a huge milestone in October and November, passing that. We, a couple of specifics that we were really in favor of was expanding the allowance of ADUs within our community. We think that's a good experiment in trying to figure out different kinds of housing and different ways to house our residents, and also modernizing the zoning rules in our corridors to allow different kinds of development along places like Santa Fe, Bellevue, Littleton Boulevard, Broadway, so that townhomes, new homes that couldn't be built just because it was zoned a business commercial previously. Updating that zone district is really important to sort of unlocking the potential for housing within our community. I think I've shown you guys this graphic before. Not all of you have probably seen it, but I've shown a lot of people on this call before. I think traditionally, or maybe over the past 70 years as a country, we've thought of development as the two things on the far right and the far left: detached single family homes and large apartment buildings. And both of those very much have a place in our community and elsewhere. But there's, if we're going to maintain a community that is affordable for the median family, for people like firefighters and school teachers and all the rest, then we need to start figuring out different ways to provide housing. And that includes things like attached townhomes, duplexes, smaller apartment buildings that fit better within the context of a neighborhood, things like that. And so that is something that we feel like we're starting to make steps towards, and are optimistic that we can continue to do so. Number 4, survey vacant and underutilized parcels. We started studying this about 1.5 years ago and very quickly came to realize that there's not a lot of vacant parcels in Littleton. There's not a lot of open fields that any of us want to see developed, with the exception of a few small places. And so really what vacant and underutilized means in our context is redevelopment. It's those, it's a place like Columbine Square. I think everybody on this call would love to see that redeveloped eventually. It's also just, sort of functionally obsolete old retail centers that have a ton of parking that is empty all day long. And maybe it would be better if there were some homes for people there. So we feel like the list there is pretty short, but also could have a really big impact on our community and on our housing policy. Number 5, affordable preservation and development. That's, I think, what we're going to spend a lot of our time tonight talking about. Something we've done already is initiate this process of studying an inclusionary housing ordinance, and the city has gone under contract with Root Policy, and we are very excited about that. And that is very much step 1 in a multi-step process, but that's what we've done on that front so far, and where we're shifting our attention in the year to come. So what is next? What still needs to be done in all of these areas? A couple of key points for me. I think it is going to be a huge task of this council, as well as us as a task force and all the other committees and subcommittees, to understand, is our ULUC working? Are all of the things that we sought to achieve being achieved? Are we creating, transforming the corridors into places that people can live? Are we finding new ways to house people within the neighborhoods without compromising community character? And to sort of take an iterative approach to that and see what is working and lean into that, what's not working and pivot from that. Number 2, I think, continuing to focus on corridor redevelopment, but especially continuing to identify specific opportunities like Aspen Grove being a very relevant conversation in the city right now, Columbine Square, the Enzer property, and all sorts of other retail and other properties within our community that are ripe for redevelopment in the short, medium, and long term. We want to study those, understand those, and be able to make solid fact-based recommendations to the city so that they can make informed policy decisions as it relates to housing as various rezones and other applications come in through planning. So this last part, I'll let Kate take over for me. And she's just going to lay the groundwork for what an inclusionary housing ordinance is, how we're thinking about it, what the timeline is, and I think we'll just take some time for Q&A.
Sure. So I'm Kate Hilberg. For those of you who I have not met, I am a Littleton resident, and I'm also the Director of Real Estate Development for Habitat for Humanity of Metro Denver. And, when we started this discussion a couple of years ago, like Eric had said, we quickly agreed that the logical first step of our work was to participate in the ULUC. That's, basically we're, important to set the ground rules for all development in Littleton. That would, be a big step towards where can we get more housing. But we also knew that we needed to address the how. The need in Littleton, as we looked at it through the housing study, is too great for the likes of South Metro, Housing Options, Habitat, and other nonprofits to build our, way out of the deficit of available affordable housing here. And we agreed that an IHO, an inclusionary housing ordinance, would be a logical next big lift for this team to help the city create housing policy, because it's basically a mechanism to provide additional tools to help the city further and act on the housing study recommendations. An IHO is a way to respond to that recommendation that said increased capacity for affordable preservation and development through financial resources. And it's a way to do that without necessarily tapping into the city's coffers. It's really using development as a tool to really open up more opportunities for affordable housing. And there's so many different ways to do an IHO that we knew there had to be study of, what would be a best fit for our city. So Molly's team, Root Policy, is now under contract to do some of this work and research into, what might be best for this city. And so they've started now. They will be following our presentation. Molly's gonna roll out her presentation, and probably that's the meat of a lot of what you all are interested in learning. And we're really hoping that by April we have a really good, solid recommendation that the city can act on to really further the comp plan and recommendations for how, increasing housing in the city. So, so Eric has listed here, sorry, some of the things that we feel is really important. We don't want to just copy and paste some other cities' IHO. It has to be uniquely for Littleton, and we're hoping it's incentive-based versus maybe an iron fist or whatever you would call that. But basically, that this really is important work that stems out of the housing study and everything we have done to try to make sure that, the ULUC supports housing. And now we need also some tools to support increasing housing. I think with that, we're up for Q&A.
Yeah, we are. Thanks, Kate. And the only thing I'll say, and just to reiterate what I've said from earlier and what Kate said here is, there's a huge sort of historical legacy here of us just we've gotten behind on housing production as a city. And I remember reading a statistic that Arapahoe County, which is more than just Littleton, but Arapahoe County since 2010 to 2020 grew by 14%. And our housing stock grew by 10%. So that's a 33% deficit almost in how much housing we've created versus how many people have moved in. And so there's a huge element here of us meeting the supply needs of the market, more housing and more kinds of housing. But at the end of the day, especially in an affluent city like Denver and Littleton, the Denver metro area and Littleton, where there's a lot of jobs, there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of investment interest in real estate. That you get to a point where there are people who we want to be a part of our community, who work in our schools, our public service departments, our service sectors, retail, that may never, within our lifetimes, be able to afford market rate housing again. And the inclusionary housing ordinance is about addressing that need and also about tying those two needs together. And that's why we as a housing task force are encouraging Molly, and Molly will tell us if we're right or wrong, but we're encouraging Molly to explore an incentive-based approach where the production of new housing units is encouraged along by the inclusion housing ordinance. And so then we end up with more affordable income restricted housing, and we end up with more market rate housing at the end as a result of it, and that they're very symbiotic and synergistic. So with that, I'll open it up to Q&A and just remind you that Molly has a whole presentation specifically about the IHO as well. So this is just a Q&A for us.
Hey, if we can get council to use the little hand raise function so we can try to do this as orderly as possible, that'd be great. Looks like we got Councilmember Milliman.
Hey, y'all. Thank you for your presentation. I am so excited you're presenting tonight. I do have a question about the housing study. I know the first one was done in 2017, and there was a refresher in 2020. Can you just refresh us again? Were there any significant changes from 2017 to 2020? Or was it 2019? 2020, I think it was. 2020.
Yeah, I'll let Corey take that one. Or Yvonne, one of them, whoever wants to.
I can tell you what I remember that stayed very much the same, which the two or the three top needs that were identified in the first housing study seemed to remain true in the second, which was affordable starter homes for families, housing for seniors that are low maintenance, no stairs, so they can downgrade, and units, rental units for those around 30% AMI, which was about $25,000 per year. So those, I don't think those changed at all. A lot of the other, and Molly can speak to this too, I suspect. A lot of the trends remain the same in terms of wages not growing as fast as housing prices, that, some of those things we hear over and over that don't seem to be changing.
And the average number of housing units that we're short still remains at 6,500. Is that right?
Yeah, that, as members of this council and task force have always raised their hand about, that's 6,500 is a peg on the wall, right? And in reality, we already have a deficit that exceeds we already have a deficit. So if you add that to 6,500, that number is greater. But as much as anything, that number is about gauging how much we are short in supply in comparison to our overall housing stock. Not necessarily saying that, if we build exactly 6,500 units, all problems will be solved, or if we miss that by a few hundred units, we're gonna, this community is going down the drain. It's just it's sort of a target that we're working towards, that we mentioned, that is important to help contextualize the issue. And that number did stay the same, Kelly. But
Yeah.
It is, I always like to caveat that nobody needs to get too hung up on that, aside from the fact that it is important.
Right. And the 6,500 housing units, that's not just affordable housing, that's housing all across the spectrum, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And how do you, how do you address when folks say, we have enough housing in Littleton, we're good, we don't need to add any more housing?
I mean, I think to me that question is self-evident, because we've all watched our rent or our mortgage or the values of our home skyrocket in the last decade. And that's clearly in part a product of market demand. There's tons of factors that generate housing price, but it's also housing demand. And when it's growing that much faster than wages, it's telling you that there are more and more people putting demand pressure on the market. It's a very well documented fact in studies, both specific like the ones we've conducted in Littleton, but also on an academic and regional wide level, that we have a housing shortage. It might feel like we have enough housing in our community because we all have a home, but all of the things that I just mentioned are sort of the indicators that are flowing underneath the surface of not everybody has a home. Homelessness is an increasing problem. People being house burdened, housing cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 35% of their income to housing costs every month. That number is on the rise. It is clearly, we're clearly at a shortage, and it's easy to wake up every morning and say, well, I've got a home. I guess we've got plenty of houses, but there's a lot of people out there that are struggling on all sorts of different levels.
Thank you.
Councilmember Driscoll's got his hand up.
Sure. Eric, you and I have had this conversation, and I'm a firm believer in the market will drive this issue. We're trying to solve, much like homelessness, we're trying to solve something that is not just a Littleton issue. It's a Colorado issue in any other popular state out there. It's an issue across the board. Out of those 6,500 units, what is your thought as far as making those affordable? I'm assuming you're thinking 80% of the average median income. When you talk about people having to use 35% of their income to afford a home, well, guidelines, Fannie and Freddie, say you can go up as high as 50%. There's other guidelines that say you could go even higher. So this concept of Littleton needs more and more and more, I don't buy it. We're a landlocked community, and we have a few parcels out there that can still get developed, but then yet we have this great task force that you guys are on, and then you have 4,500 citizens saying we don't need any more housing in Aspen Grove. So I feel like we're kind of at odds with the community as to what we really need. And I understand what the board, what your committee's doing. I get it. But I also think the market needs to be addressed sooner than later to say, at some point, the developer's going to say, sorry, Littleton, we're not interested in doing that because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't pencil. And that's been one of my arguments for the last 4 years to most of council members, is it doesn't pencil in a lot of cases. Now, if Corey and the city want to donate Geneva Village and start developing that, and at zero cost, then you might have something. But again, I think you have a huge challenge ahead of you. So my question, out of the 6,500 units, what's the thought as far as how many could potentially be fit that bill of affordable housing?
Eric, I'll take that question. I mean, Patrick, to be honest, 6,500 of them could be affordable. So
you find me a builder that can build affordable, then you've done something special. Now, again, if people are donating land, then you might have something.
So we're currently building 51 units at Powers and Alati. So I'm the director of real estate
Yvonne,
for the. Yeah, go ahead.
Second, can you just introduce yourself since you're not on the screen here? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. And I apologize that I'm not on the screen. I've actually been out sick for a couple of weeks from the office, and so you don't want to see me right now. But my name is Yvonne, and I'm the director of real estate for South Metro Housing Options, which is the housing authority for the city of Littleton. And Patrick, we are currently developing. So we are building affordable housing right now, 51 units, which you guys approved some funding for last week. December 15th, we also closed on a property that we purchased it's got a office building that has 60,000 square feet on it, and we will be developing somewhere around 140 to 150 units on that property. Quite frankly, it's you're right that definitely there are a lot of market factors at play, but at the same time there are policy factors at play that I think we need to consider. And so being able to develop not just affordable housing, but housing in general are very much constrained by both market factors as well as policy. And so, at the end of the day, if you asked, how many of those units could be affordable, all 6,500 of them really could be affordable.
So
I'm not suggesting that all 6,500 should be affordable. I'm simply just responding to your question.
Oh, I understand that, but anything can be possible. But
well, and
is anybody in the business? Is anybody in the
I'll say,
business to make
Councilman
money?
Driscoll, that there's a couple of things here. That I spend my every day.
Who is it talking now? Was it? I'm sorry. It's hard.
Eric Veith is talking. He's on the screen.
Maybe if people could announce your name when you begin to speak, that'd be helpful.
Oh, okay.
Thank
This
you,
is
Eric.
Eric. I can see all of you. So there are, as Yvonne was alluding to, there are thousands upon thousands of income restricted, formally affordable units that get built across our country and our state every single year. It is really a policy and funding question. There are also many more market rate units that get built every year. And what we're talking about right now, the inclusionary housing ordinance, is a well-built one, uses that strong capital demand to build new housing, of which there is plenty out there, because there's a strong market demand for people to rent and buy housing. It uses that strong market demand to also generate affordable units. So if we're talking about 6,500, if we built 6,500 affordable units, would we find people to fill them? Yes, probably. Is that our plan necessarily? Is that the goal we're striving for as a task force? No. But there's also another really important point to keep in mind, which is that in such a supply constrained market like we're in right now, all housing takes some pressure off the system. And so just like when you buy a new car and the new car is expensive and it has bells and whistles and all of that, housing developers, in order to have a profitable business, need to build newer, higher end housing. But that is by no means the enemy of affordability. Allowing the creation of market rate housing, it relieves pressure from the system overall. And like I mentioned, when you do it right, it pulls in, more officially affordable housing along with it. Usually these days, those units get built inside a market rate project. So if you have a 200 unit apartment building, they might be 10 or 20% of those units might be income restricted. And that is using, and oftentimes not by any subsidy of the city that they're being built in. They're just using the momentum of the market to require that those private developers end up building some affordable housing to contribute to the community that they're profiting in.
Find my cursor here. I saw Councilmember Milliman raise her hand, but Councilmember Valdez, you did right after her, and I'm going to give you a chance to speak since Kelly's already spoken. Jerry.
Oh, thank you. I thought you said right after her.
No, I'll let you go first.
And Kyle, I do see everybody. It's just important for the audience at home to know whom is speaking. That's why I brought that part up. I have a couple questions. When we talked about Arapahoe County, growing, and it's a lot of it is commercial. That is primarily out East Arapahoe, where that's just growing, leaps and bounds. If you ever drive out there, there's rooftop after rooftop where there's new residential homes and things like that. There's plenty of residential, but there's also lots of commercial being built because there's a lot of open space. I think as we focus more on Littleton, and that's what is important, on those 51 units that are being built over at Powers and Elati, those are all for rent units. Is that right, Corey?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, and Corey, I also know that at one time, oh golly, at least 15 years ago, the Housing Authority, then it was Littleton Housing Authority doing business as, built some homes and they sold them to income qualified folks. Do you have any plans to do that going forward? I know it's an expensive avenue to go, but do you have any plans for that type of program?
No, not at the moment. We don't.
Not as the Housing Authority, though we are partnering with Habitat for Humanity on a couple of endeavors to provide for sale or home ownership opportunities.
Thank you. That's it.
I'm gonna go to Councilmember Barr has his hand up there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is Steve Barr for the record. Thank you guys for your great presentation. I appreciate you trying to squeeze a lot of information that's relatively complex and nuanced into a short time span. I wanted to see if we could, I guess I'm still in this learning process, being new to council, on the actors and the players. And I think to Councilmember Driscoll's point, we are not alone in this process. In fact, we are a relatively small player as compared to the entirety of the Front Range that is all experiencing growth in certain ways. And nor can Littleton necessarily be expected to carry the full weight of the entirety of that growth. So I'm wondering, what are our neighbor, what is the county, what are our neighboring municipalities in Centennial and Englewood? How are they kind of tackling this issue? Do they have equivalent housing task forces that are also looking at similar goals and metrics as to this group? And how do we kind of rise the tide together rather than constantly playing leapfrog with each other?
Who wants to take that one? Molly might actually be the best person to answer that one. She's probably worked with half of them.
Yeah, and this is Kathleen O'Shar, Community Services Director, but I'll just weigh in a little bit that we've been keeping a close eye, particularly after the legislature made their decision. And then our Denver Regional Council of Governments has done a cohort. So it's allowed communities to kind of explore some options and think collectively about it. It is still something that we're seeing a lot of customization, which is why it has made so much sense to move in the direction of working directly with Root to dig in, particularly on a Littleton front. But with that, Molly, what would you add?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Molly Fitzpatrick with Root Policy Research. And yeah, just to kind of piggyback on that, I think most communities, honestly, in the metro have really, over the past 3 to 5 years, really started to take a closer look at housing and what their role could be, and how do we like preserve who we are as a community, and how does housing policy fit into that? So I would say, broadly speaking, there's a lot of energy around housing task force for a variety of communities, looking at a variety of policy incentives as well as funding mechanisms. So we've done a lot of work with a handful of those communities as well. Westminster is one that's done quite a bit. Aurora has done quite a bit as well, as have Broomfield has taken quite a few steps just in the past few years. So those are just kind of a few that I would say jump out as ones that have really said, okay, let's have a task force. Let's make some meaningful change. Let's put some really clear goals out there and try to move those forward. But to Kathleen's point as well, with the changes in policy around inclusionary housing, and we'll talk about those real briefly. But basically the legislature said, look, this has always been an option for sale housing, and now it's an option for rental as well. So it's a little bit more of a comprehensive option as of just last year. And so there's a lot more communities that are starting to take a look at that. DRCOG taking a leading role in helping educate communities about what the options are, and that kind of thing as well. So, and to the extent that context is helpful, we'd be happy to, as part of our scope, to provide just a little bit of kind of a survey of the other metro communities to let you know just really broadly kind of what they're looking at from that perspective. So we can add a little bit of that context into our deliverables.
Thanks, Molly. I think we should actually turn it over to Molly for her presentation. If there's actually, it looks like.
I just wanted to have Councilmember Milliman had a question, and then I just wanted to add a quick question before we move on to that.
So I wanted to, before we do that, sorry, this is Eric Veith again. I wanted to really quickly address something that Councilman Valdez said, which is that this concept of, you know, a lot of our housing units are being built out in Parker and Southeast Aurora, which is absolutely true. And despite all of that massive sprawl, new rooftops, new retail centers that we see, we still are falling short of producing enough housing units to meet the demand or the new population. So still our county grew by 14% and the number of housing units only grew by 10. And our perspective on this as the Housing Task Force, and this is backed by tons of research, is that in order to meet your housing demands and to prevent onward skyrocketing housing prices, you need to have housing creation in all places, not just on the fringes of the city, more and more and more suburban sprawl, but also you need to find ways to put housing where there already is development and redevelop underutilized parcels and things like that. So I'll get off the soapbox again.
Thanks. Kelly?
Thank you, Mayor. This actually is probably a question for Kathleen. Kathleen, could you speak to us, maybe as a refresher again, how housing is tied to economic viability, economic development, specifically within our city, within the city of Littleton?
Yeah, and I think Mark might have a few thoughts to add on this front as well. But you know, one of the big pieces now with having Cindy Perry in our economic development manager role, one of the things that we're continually hearing from employers is just the challenge of finding staff. And you know, if you want to consider Mark our top employer, which he is one, we're seeing equally as many challenges, as you know, from the memo that was distributed to council today. So part of that challenge, once, if you're successful in going through the process of hiring someone, the next thing that we're hearing is the challenge of finding housing, particularly for candidates that may be coming from outside the region or outside the state. But we know that housing is going to be a key piece to an economic development strategy. We're collecting that data and indexing that to really identify and refine where we think we can measure some progress on an economic development strategy. And you know that we're doing that work in 2022 with the hope of a strategic plan in 2023. As part of that process, what we are learning is that one unique advantage that we think Littleton has, and we hope to verify with the data, is that we have a very talented and skilled workforce. So how do we continue to brand and market the city around companies wanting to be close to that very talented and skilled workforce? So being able to have the housing that continues that trend and continues that accumulation of talent in the city of Littleton, I think is going to be a cornerstone of how we attract employers and grow the number of jobs that we see for both the people that live in Littleton and as we grow as a city. So Mark, I'm sure you'd like to add a couple of things as well.
May I, Mayor, just add a couple of comments?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, I wanted to add a little context to the 6,500, just how that number came to be, but then also talk about and add on to what Kathleen had to say specifically. So the 6,500, if the council will remember, that number came about in the very beginning of the comprehensive planning process, where we brought in the state demographer and talked about what is the likely increase in population here of the city of Littleton over the next 20 years. And so remember, we had a high and a low, and we picked something that was in the middle. The importance of that number, 6,500, is to make sure as we went through the land use conversation that we could accommodate that if possible. Mission accomplished. ULUC, when we passed that, mixed use corridors specifically, allowed us the opportunity to kind of meet that target. So it's not necessarily a housing number that we're trying to strive for specifically. It's trying to make sure that the ULUC, it's specifically the zoning can allow for that. Now, the question at hand, housing. Council has identified this as a goal. And so I think this conversation, and I think the debate of the future here is for us to figure out, well, how do we term success? What does that look like? How do we measure that? I think cities in the entire Front Range are wrestling with exactly the same questions. And so when kind of add to the need for economic analysis here is that, we've already heard through the surveys every 2 years from the business community, at least 6 years, one of the number one issues they've identified, the business community, is they need affordable housing for their workforce. And so that's in part what has spurred on some of that conversation beginning in 2017 with the Housing Task Force, the business community. So I think all of this is very difficult. And I think as we kind of look at all these tools, one of the questions we should be asking us is how do we measure success? And that, no doubt, will be very difficult and will change over time.
Thanks. The comments that Mark and Kelly just made kind of were leading me into mine, which was, looking back at this conversation about housing, if you look back at our council goals, I think everything we talk about should, have its foot within those goals. And if you look at this broader topic of housing, its roots are in every single one of the goals that the previous council outlined there. And I think, the two main ones that I see that it's most upfront is obviously goal 6, which is housing and livability, but also goal 3, which was innovative infrastructure. And when we were looking at that description of, single family versus multi-family and the missing middle, I think that's where this idea of this innovative infrastructure can really take place there, of things that we maybe aren't doing or doing well here in Littleton that we can look at to be a little more innovative. And I think that's kind of goes back to that idea that I was going to ask, talk about sprawl versus density, but Eric hit on that as this idea of this growth in this whole region that, it doesn't have to be either or. Obviously there's going to be both, and we got to figure out the balance there, the waltz of those two. And we can't just expect everyone to build out at the fringes. You look at places building into the grasslands, and as we all saw all too tragically, 2 weeks ago with the fires in Superior and Louisville, as we continue to build the single type of housing of single family residential further and further out into the outskirts, there's ramifications for that as well if we don't look inward at the same time. And we can move on to this topic on the inclusionary housing ordinance. But as we talk about that, I want to, kind of, if there can be some discussion or talk about kind of the opposite end of that, of exclusionary zoning. Kind of what we're moving away from is what we had in Littleton before, with our zoning being exclusionary, and looking at what it means to actually be inclusionary with that. So I will turn that back over to Molly to lead us in that discussion.
Great. Well, good evening, Mayor, Council. I guess I'll give my formal hello now that I'm actually presenting, but I'm Molly Fitzpatrick, a Managing Director at Root Policy Research. We're a local economic and policy firm. We are based in Denver, but we work actually all over the country. So we bring a lot of kind of the national best practice perspective, but really understand Colorado markets, particularly along the Front Range, a lot of the growth and growth pressure that communities throughout the metro have been experiencing. So that's a little bit about our background. I won't belabor that too much. Obviously, I hope that we kind of continue this great discussion as we kind of start to pinpoint a little bit more directly some of the particular tools and options that you have as you move forward, as you think about kind of this broad structure of housing policy that we've been talking about. And now we're going to focus in a little bit on one of these particular tools that obviously you've contracted with us to provide you some additional context on and additional research. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So hopefully that will come up, and we'll kind of walk you through. So hold on just a moment while I get reoriented after screen sharing, which is always my biggest challenge. Sorry, just a moment. All right, so you should be seeing it now, but let me know if you're not.
All I'm seeing is it started
Oh.
to screen share. I haven't seen anything yet. Has anyone else seen it?
Oh, interesting. Okay, I'll try again. Let's see. How about now? Any luck?
There we go.
Oh, okay, perfect. Great. So, you know, we've talked a little bit about the project background, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. Obviously, we've referenced that affordability or the council goal around housing and livability. And so really what we're talking about tonight in terms of this additional research is just one of the tools within that. Root has been around throughout a lot of the things we've talked about, as you can see on this timeline, related to the initial housing study, which was done in 2017, the recommendations to council in 2018, which, as we talked about, got folded into the comprehensive plan, the 2020 data update as well, and then now in 2021, looking specifically at these housing incentives and or inclusionary housing policies. So we really feel like we can kind of hit the ground running with that context. But I think what is really exciting is to see some of this really coming into fruition. And as you're taking a look at these, you know, we want to understand the context of where your priorities are as they relate to the housing policy, housing inclusionary policy. And we'll talk about that specifically as we get going here. So I was going to give you kind of a little bit of context here on the housing needs review. We've talked about a lot of this, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through it. But if you have questions, feel free to stop me and we can talk through that as well. But, you know, we talked through the 2017 as well as 2020 study. Those needs were really the same or really affirmed in the 2020 data update. So looking at a need for affordable rentals, a need for starter homes, entry-level home options, as well as housing options that are attractive to seniors. And that doesn't necessarily just mean seniors, but it really means housing alternatives. So low maintenance housing options with fewer or no stairs. So looking at some of those alternative housing types like missing middle types. So acknowledging that a need for increased diversity in your housing stock is there as well, particularly as it relates to those low maintenance options. Recommendations as well, we talked through those in pretty good detail. So I'll just kind of move through this, but happy to come back to it if you have any specific questions. I do want to give some just kind of broad brush context for just housing policy in general. Obviously, you know, there's a lot going on metro-wide throughout communities in the metro related to housing policy, how folks are taking a look at that. A lot of task force being initiated, a lot of folks really taking a look at what is our role as local government in this world. And so I just want to kind of give some introduction so we're all on the same page. I know some of you have a lot more experience in the housing policy world than others. So to kind of baseline and ground us, I just want to talk for a moment about what we mean when we say affordable housing. And so really, you know, as was mentioned before, an industry standard is around that 30 to 40% of your income going toward housing. So when we think about affordability, we really think about the housing that you're in being affordable to the occupant, right? And that means a percentage of your income that's reasonable is going toward that housing. That's what we call kind of lowercase a affordable housing. When we talk about capital A affordable housing, we're really talking more about an income restriction or a deed restriction that specifies that housing is capped at a certain price point or has a specific limitation on it in terms of the income of the person or how much it can be sold for or appreciate over time. And that's really the kind of capital A affordable housing. That's when we start talking about AMI levels, so area median income, and at what kind of target incomes we're hitting for different housing options and that sort of thing. So I just want to kind of keep that in mind, is that we're thinking about both of those concepts. We want to think about, you know, the supply issue and making sure that there's a diversity of housing types, that we're building in ways that have that kind of lowercase a affordability option. But there's always going to be a need as well for that capital A affordable housing. So products like Habitat produce, products like South Metro housing options produce as well. And so those tend to target this lower end of the AMI spectrum, which you can see on your screen here. I'm not going to walk through every little component of this, but you know, we've got an MFI here. Those are interchangeable. So median family income or area median income are used fairly interchangeably in the housing policy world. So as we think about that 30% AMI or MFI up to 50, that's where some of those programs are going to be targeted more toward that end of the spectrum. Programs that have some type of public subsidy attached, whether it's a land donation or a community development block grant contribution, like you all approved just earlier this month. And so as we think about what the market tends to provide, it tends to be at the higher end of the spectrum and really beyond the spectrum that we're even looking at here. So typical new market rate development for rentals are going to be in the 100% to 120% AMI range. Typically, when we think about new development in terms of home ownership, that tends to be closer to 200% AMI in terms of where the market is trying to hit. And so as we think about some of these options, and we'll talk through specifically inclusionary options, there's a lot of different housing policies, some of which target the very low end. Those tend to be programmatic or subsidy-oriented programs, and some of which are targeting the higher end just to try to expand housing supply, as we were talking about before. A lot of your land use code options can help move that private sector or private market provision down to lower price points just simply by freeing up the regulatory market a bit. But we're never going to get all the way down to, for example, 50% AMI with just those land use and supply oriented reforms. And so as we start talking about inclusionary or incentive programs, we're trying to kind of, as was mentioned before, capitalize on that new development, but also make sure it includes some targeted income restricted or capital A affordable housing as well.
Oh, this is Kyle. I just wanted to jump in there and just reiterate the point that, I think you were making there, that some people also confuse that affordable means making a $500,000 or $1 million home affordable to someone that can't afford it, which is not what that means. It's, having the options of the housing type available and the stock available, which oftentimes is not available in places like Littleton before. So
yeah, great point. And it doesn't necessarily just mean building the same exact house, but for the different price point. It really is about kind of calibrating that to the needs of the community as well as to the incomes of the folks that are in that housing. So at a really high level, and we've talked about this to some extent from the supply orientation, but as we think about why these problems exist, why do we have affordable housing needs? Why is our private market not perfectly meeting the needs of the community? There's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of economic challenges with the housing market. We tend to think of it as a free market, but it doesn't actually behave that way, right? We impose a lot of constraints on the housing market, and a lot of times with really good reason, but that means it doesn't always deliver exactly what the community needs or what is really in perfect demand. And several reasons for that is that the housing is really dynamic. It's not just a single commodity or a single good. When you're buying a house, you are, or when you're looking for a rental unit, you are also investing in the community. You're looking at, what does this get me in terms of a school? How close is this to my job? What is my commute? What are the parks like? So you're buying really this whole bundle of goods as we think about it. It's not just the commodity itself. And that makes it really, really unique in terms of meeting supply and demand. It's not quite as simple as we'd like it to be from an economic perspective sometimes. It's also fundamentally local, right? So as Eric mentioned, there are historically regulatory barriers to building housing, challenges with zoning codes, all of these other things that make it really hard for local housing supply to always meet local housing needs. Supply isn't expanding fast enough. That's general. That's metro-wide. That's not just Littleton. But just in thinking about that, but broadly speaking, housing always lags the demand because it's development is a responsive industry, and it's going to respond to demand, but housing doesn't get built in a day as well. So it takes time for that to catch up. And then obviously you sort of layer on construction costs, labor costs, the regulatory environment, that all gets pretty complicated pretty fast. And for some of those reasons, the housing that is produced doesn't always meet community needs. There's also inconsistent philosophies around how government interacts with housing, and that doesn't just mean whether or not government subsidizes housing, but it also means to what extent is government sort of regulating the zoning and the land use, and what does that look like? So all of those are kind of layered on to exacerbate some of these housing challenges. And when we're in a high growth from a population perspective area and a high economic growth area, like the Denver Metro is, like Littleton is, these challenges are exacerbated and we see prices start to go up as a result. So to the point of when we're talking about some of the other communities, what are other communities doing about this right now? Here's just kind of a hit list of really common approaches that communities are taking. This is obviously generic in some ways, but housing planning and affordability goals are top of the list. That's one of the key things that communities start to do when they're thinking about these housing challenges. Providing direct services to residents is also a common approach. We've seen quite a bit of that, certainly through the American Rescue Plan and the CARES Act, as kind of in crisis mode, providing those direct services. But we're seeing that as an ongoing basis as well. And then affordable unit production and preservation. We're obviously talking about that tonight specifically. Land use and zoning reforms, which you all have already done quite a bit of work on around the development code or the land use code. So taking a look at those. And then also local funding is a really common approach as well. As we see, national funding in particular has been diminishing in terms of direct housing funding over the past decade or several decades even. And so we're seeing more and more options where local governments are saying we'd like to supplement that so that we can expand some of our housing supply according to our own priorities. Excuse me. As we talked about, the private sector is a huge player. The private sector is always going to be a huge player. When we think about housing policy, we're not really talking about, okay, how can the government come in and do this differently? We really want to talk about how can local government be partnering with private sector and thinking about leveraging that expertise. Excuse me. So, excuse me, hold on just a moment. Apologies, I'm recovering from being sick, so a little bit of coughing occasionally. So as we really start to move in to talking about the incentive and inclusionary research that Root is going to do, I want to give you, excuse me, I want to give you just a little bit more context to our scope, what we're taking a look at, and then we'll talk about inclusionary policies in general. So as we embark on this project, it's really our goal to provide you additional research that helps you make an informed decision about some of these policies, that helps you identify the structure, benefits, and challenges of those policies, as well as the market feasibility. And that's where we really get into, excuse me, making sure this pencils, making sure this does work on paper, as well as in actual practice. So our tasks you can see here on the screen, we're working over the next few months to help provide some of this information. Tonight, the goal is to focus just on the context of the project and just kind of an introduction to what the policy options are, what the policy components are, and talking through those. And then you can see we'll move into additional conversations about that, as well as the feasibility analysis, and then the report and presentation. So programs that leverage private development to create affordable housing options, that's what we're talking about when we talk about inclusionary or incentive-based programs. Linkage fees are another typical option for this type of approach. So inclusionary traditionally is basically a requirement to provide affordable housing when you build new housing. So the example that we're illustrating here on the screen is thinking about a 3-story base development. And this is just an example. In a traditional inclusionary program, that's just a mandatory requirement to provide affordable housing. You build your 3-story development and you're required to make a couple of the units within that affordable to certain price points, certain AMI levels. A linkage fee option is a similar program, but instead of requiring affordable units, it essentially requires a fee. And a linkage fee differs to some extent because it's more like an impact fee, and then it applies to all types of development. But you don't have to actually build any affordable units, you just pay a fee. The third type of program that leverages private development for affordable production is an incentive-based program. It's similar to an inclusionary, and that it asks for affordable units to be incorporated into the development of the building. But instead of just saying you have to do this because you're building a new development, it says we as a city are going to give you something extra in exchange for those affordable units. So we want to leverage what you are doing, but also create the housing that we know that we need. And so in this example, it's illustrating sort of a height bonus or a density bonus where the 3-story base development exists, but the city says, look, we're going to let you build 2 extra stories as long as you include X% of affordable units.
This is Kyle. While you have this slide up, I just had a quick question about the
Sure.
linkage fees. I don't know if anyone else on the task force or Kathleen or Mark could jump in here as well. But what are some examples of what those that linkage fee would go towards? You know, typically it's to go towards to fund some other affordable housing, but is there some other options or, you know, examples you provide?
Yeah, great question. So typically a linkage fee, if it's an affordable housing linkage fee, is required to go to the development of affordable housing. So typically it would go into like a housing trust fund that then can get used to build affordable housing. Not that the city has to build it, but it would be going into a fund where, for example, the city could say, okay, we're going to give that money to Habitat. We're going to give that money to South Metro to actually produce affordable housing. So similar to an impact fee, it has to go to the benefit of what is creating that impact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I just wanted you to touch on that to see.
Yep,
You know,
great point.
I don't know if Corey had anything to add about that, of how that would work working with South Metro. You know, obviously they would love to have additional funds there, and if he has experience with, you know, with that.
Yeah, we don't have any experience with that, but we certainly would be excited to have a fund similar to this. Again, we need a lot of assistance generally to be able to develop our property. So this is something that I think the concern is in terms of how many units are built. If there aren't, you know, a substantial amount of units built, then that fund is obviously a lot lower. So that would be my concern with that particular option strategy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, go ahead, Molly.
Great.
Molly, can I ask you
Sure.
a quick question, and you may already be anticipating covering it. This is Eric again. Do you have some other examples of other types of incentives that can be extended to private developers other than just height bonuses?
Yeah, absolutely. So this obviously it's just an easy way to kind of illustrate the type of a certain type of incentives. Other really common incentives are parking reductions, so changing your parking requirements if affordable housing is included. Changing density. It doesn't just have to be height. So we see it in terms of single family or ownership products. We see density differences or lot size reductions for the inclusion of affordable housing in terms of, and usually it's structured as sort of a percentage of units. If you give us 10% of your units at 80% AMI, you get these other benefits. So other regulatory kind of variances for zoning, setbacks, parking reductions, density, height. Occasionally we'll see like a parkland a reduction. That's not nearly as common. I'd say the most common are density, height, and parking, or fee reductions. So that has less to do with actually the zoning variance, but like a utility fee reduction as well is pretty common. So the benefit, obviously, of the incentive program, I think really speaks to what Eric was talking about before of let's add supply, but let's also leverage that. So as you can see, you know, in this example, the incentive not only creates additional units above and beyond what would be created by the private market, because in a sort of without the incentive program, you'd just be creating those 3 stories. This actually adds supply by expanding height, just in this example, but it also allocate some of that supply to specific price points. So we know, as I mentioned, we're never going to get down to that 50, 60% AMI just with market rate development. Even though adding supply does take some of the pressure off, it doesn't ever get down to those lower price points. And so using kind of some of these tools as a city to say, okay, let's get that, but let's get it through this. And to Councilmember Driscoll's point earlier, making sure it pencils, the benefit of an incentive program is that you, by giving additional density in this example, you're giving additional profit to the developer. You're saying, we're going to let you build more units than you otherwise would. So you're going to make more money, and we'd like a piece of that, basically, right? So we like a piece of that in the form of units that have an income restriction, meet a housing need that we have identified, and that we want to make sure that we hit. So that's the benefit of the incentive, and that's also the point of the feasibility analysis, is to understand what pencils, how valuable are the incentives that you want to keep on the table, and what does that get you in terms of affordable ask. So as I mentioned, this feasibility approach, which is part of our scope, is to take a look at that. That would apply to both. You always want to do a feasibility if you're doing an inclusionary or an incentive-based program. I realize we're kind of talking about those interchangeably. When I say inclusionary, I sort of mean that mandate without an incentive or a mandate with an incentive. So a feasibility analysis looks at real estate pro formas. It says, look, this is how much it costs to develop. This is how much more money you would make with these incentives. And then this is how much the city could realistically extract in terms of kind of requiring a certain affordability level out of that development, but still making sure that that incentive is attractive to developers. So we don't want to just throw requirements out there and then no one takes them because they're not good business, right? So we want to make sure that the incentive is actually has some value, that it's attractive to developers, that private sector folks are going to want to take that. Now, we also want to make sure that it fits in the context of the community, and say, we don't want to say like, oh, well, you can have like 20 extra stories. That would be fine. That's not what what Littleton wants. That's not what you want to see as well. But there may be areas you can do this by parts of town. You can do it by specific use types, and we can kind of get into the weeds of that as we move through this process. But it does require a little bit of give and take, right? So to be able to give the developer something, we may have to think about where is that appropriate? Where does that make sense? Both from a market perspective, but also from a community context perspective. So, and the bottom line here on feasibility is that we're talking about market-driven programs. We're talking about leveraging the private sector development that would be occurring already for the benefit of the community. And so if no one takes the incentive, or if no builders want to develop in Littleton, as a result, that's a fail, right? We want to make sure that these are designed, that they're calibrated locally, that they make sense for your market and for your development, as well as for your housing needs. So I'd like to pause there before we jump into kind of the next couple slides, and they're the last couple slides I have. Start to get into just kind of start framing out some of the questions that we will be talking about, that we're going to be asking about, and we can discuss some of these. But before we get into kind of the weeds of what elements go into that, where are the trade-offs with these types of programs, I just want to pause for a moment and see if there's any questions in general on incentive-based programs versus mandatory inclusionary programs, or even the kind of the AMI levels or any of the supply challenges that we've talked about. So I'll pause there for questions on that general context, and then we can dive into a little bit more discussion around some of the policy priorities and trade-offs.
All right, thanks for that. Councilmember Milliman shot her hand up there.
Molly. Sorry, you have a cough. I hope you're feeling better.
All right. It comes and goes.
So can you go back to slide 7? I think at the it's why do we have affordable housing needs?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Under number 3, supply isn't expanding fast enough. There's a couple of reasons why. The last one is regulatory environment. Could you tell us or define what the regulatory and what do you mean regulatory environment?
Yeah, great question. This is a fairly vague and a little bit of a generic slide, but in general, we're talking about the regulatory environment around housing. We're talking about land use and zoning, as well as kind of the building approval process. And so how long does it take to get a building permit? What's the process for that? How much time is tied up in that, as well as what can I build and how fast can I build it? I guess are really the main things. Certainly building codes are part of the regulatory environment. Those tend to be a little bit more standardized and vary less community to community. But generally speaking, there we're talking about land use regulation and development process.
And that pertains to local governments, municipalities, right?
Yes.
We're not talking about the state of Colorado. We're not talking about CDOT. We're not talking about, EPA, whatever. We're talking about local zoning policies, correct?
Yes, correct.
So that comes back, that tells me it's on us. The onus is on council for these land use policies, these zoning changes, whether we expand the housing supply or not. So that segues into, I think, nicely into the housing ordinance. So
yep, great point.
Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else have any questions? Not seeing any here, so okay, we can continue.
Great. So I know that's kind of a lot of policy wonkiness that we're kind of wading through, and certainly the goal of tonight is not to answer all of these questions or get a clear perspective. My goal for tonight is really just to kind of start teeing up this conversation and maybe start planting some seeds for thought as you all are starting to consider, what does this look like? How does this apply to Littleton, and how do we start thinking about this moving forward? So I want to kind of leave you with a few questions. I'll kind of walk through these and then we can go back and discuss any of them, but I know we're getting close on time as well, so I don't want to belabor it too long. But some of the key considerations that we'll start thinking about and presenting options to you for within this kind of program design is what AMI levels should the program target? Now, obviously, the market rate units will be determined by the market, but so when we say those, the AMI levels, we're really talking about when we're requiring affordable, capital A affordable, where do we want to target those needs? And those typically differ between rental and owner options. So you can set different AMI targets. You can also set different AMI targets by how much of an incentive you're giving. So this is typically driven by a housing needs analysis. We know where your housing needs are. We've talked about those a little bit. So it is to some extent a policy call, but it's also, we'll provide you some additional information about where those needs are greatest and what kind of incentives can generate in terms of affordability price points. Another key question is, should the units have the same finishings as market rate units? So does a developer have to build exactly the same unit and then part of it is income restricted or not? Or can those look different? What are some of the options within that? That typically is a policy call. Same unit size distribution is another kind of housing needs analysis and also policy call. Different policies take different approaches here. So if you think about, for example, a rental development that has, let's say we're doing half 1 bedrooms and half 2 bedrooms, then the affordable units, if you want them to look the same, they would be half 1 bedrooms and half 2 bedrooms. There are policies that say, well, you can trade those, you can just do different things, and some of that depends on what kind of housing needs you have at what bedroom level, but that's another policy call to consider. Another key question is an on-site or off-site requirement. So, excuse me. So should developers be able to develop their units off-site? And that typically means, okay, if I'm building 20 single family homes, but and now I have an affordable requirement based on an incentive that I got, but I can build those at a different location, or do I have to integrate those into my existing development? Those are also policy options to consider. What proportion of units should be affordable? That typically is driven by the economic feasibility analysis. As I talked about, what's the value to the developer of the incentives, and what does that allow the city to ask for and still make that attractive? That moves as well with what AMIs you want to target. So if you want deeper AMIs, you tend to get fewer units. If you're okay with higher AMIs, you'll get more of those units. So those are always kind of in some type of trade-off based on the economics. Should it allow flexibility in AMI levels and unit proportions? Again, sort of policy call, as well as we'll provide some context for that with the economic feasibility. How long should we require these to be affordable? So if we're saying they have to be affordable, what makes sense? Is that 15 years? Is that 30 years? Is that 99 years? Lots of options within that as well. And should developers be allowed to pay a fee in lieu of building the units? So a lot of times these programs will be designed such that if you don't want to build the units, but you still want the incentive, you can pay a fee in lieu. The fee in lieu is more common when it's a mandatory inclusionary without an incentive than it is if it's a pure incentive-based program, but they do still exist with that. And so that's another thing to consider. And then this is my last slide, and then we can go back and talk about any of these as well. But what incentives are we actually talking about? What's on the table? There is some direction in House Bill 1117, which is what allows for inclusionary housing in the state of Colorado. There's some direction about incentives that should be considered as part of that. So we'll provide you some additional context on those. It's basically the ones we talked about before. So it's parking reductions, density. Density can be interpreted a lot of ways. That can be height, that can be lot size, all the iterations of what density looks like in addition to pure dwelling units per acre. It's also fee reductions or fee rate waivers. How can we ensure that units are occupied by those who need them? That has to do with program design, affirmative marketing, partnering with the right folks to help manage those units. We'll talk about some of those program elements as well. And then how should the program be administered? So how do we do this? Who's doing it well? And whose program who can we learn from in terms of how a city manage this? Do we outsource the income requirement enforcement? Do we hire people? What do we need to do? All of those things as well. So those are kind of all the elements that we'll be presenting you some options on. We're going to be focused on kind of the nuts and bolts of how the economic feasibility of these program options, but I want you to be thinking about, where the city's priorities are, where your priorities are, and what questions you might have to help you answer some of these or help you formulate some priorities around these. And that is, I know we're in a long housing policy meeting, so I'll stop talking, but happy to go back and talk through any of these that you'd like to kind of offer some thoughts on. Any direction you share with us at this stage is really helpful because it helps us make sure that we're answering your questions, that we're providing you the right analysis and detail to be able to give you some information about making those decisions. So anything you've got just kind of top of mind or first reactions to any of these questions, we'd love to hear. And with that, I'll stop talking and let you guys ask questions.
If anyone has questions, I just wanted to see if Mark had any thoughts to add before we get to Councilmember Valdez there about anything that, staff may be looking for direction from council here as we move forward tonight or in the future as we think about these things.
Not specifically tonight. Again, I was hoping that council would have a robust conversation here just about the topic. Again, as the council goes into the retreat here in the middle of February, I do hope that the council is going to be able to talk through, what's the real vision here? How are we going to measure success? What's the objective? And in essence, trying to answer the question, why? Why are we doing this? And, we're not necessarily going to have all the answers coming out of the retreat, but I think it's an opportunity for us to start putting down strategically the steps that we're going to take over the next couple of years to try to address this issue. That'd be my hope.
Great, thanks. All right, Councilmember Valdez.
Thank you. And Molly, excellent presentation. Thank you very much for the slides and the illustrations. I think it really does help to make it very understandable. So thank you very much for that. I know you covered a tremendous amount of information. So thank you. My question is really for Corey. As far as the Housing Authority goes, and I know you have a lot on your plate and maybe you're already doing this now, but as far as looking for other, for your investors, tax credit wise, and I think you just got a tax credit, if I'm not mistaken, not too long ago. But are you going after or searching for investors to help so you can build some properties?
There we go. So yeah, the primary way, that we develop affordable housing currently is through the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And that's exactly how it works in terms of finding an investor to partner with us to develop those, just like we have in Powers and Lottie.
So you are aggressively looking for more. I know and I suppose you and your staff are aggressively looking for more investors. I mean, it'd be great if you could find something to figure out with the Columbine property, for instance. That's just an example, as well as other properties. But good. I'm encouraged that you're going after looking for more tax credits.
Well, we talk a lot about affordable housing preservation. So, my hope through this process and inclusionary housing ordinance is, and figuring out some of those issues that we struggle with here in Littleton in terms of the property maybe not being subsidized, formally, but they're affordable, and they go on the market and become unaffordable when someone buys them and raises the rents a substantial amount. So I know one of our hopes through this is that maybe that's an area we can address, through this policy making. Because if we're not building a lot of units, which we haven't been, and at least in terms of affordable units, and then we're losing those that are already affordable, it obviously has a very negative net effect that isn't positive for the community.
Great. Thank you, Corey.
Jerry, and if I could just add to what Corey said there, and maybe give you a little bit further answer in regard to looking for investors.
That's Yvonne with.
Yeah,
South
I'm
Metro.
sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, Yvonne and I are Director of Real Estate, South Metro Housing Options. So through the tax credit program, we do seek out investment, but we also have repositioned some properties which we've spoken to council about in the past, 71 units. 12 of those we're developing into 51 new units, and 59 of them through Habitat we are renovating and providing as homeownership opportunities. We're going to turn around and use those proceeds to continue to acquire properties like the Broadway property we just acquired. Columbine Square would definitely be a target for us, should it be available to us, and so on and so forth. So we do have capital. We have repositioned some of our assets to be able to go out and essentially go out and build or acquire more units.
Excellent, Yvonne. And I know on a side note, we often hear about how, from a few folks, about how the properties that you are disposing of or have disposed of, the 71, I believe it is. But I think many of those units, did you not, I think you did, you worked to sell those to the current occupants or income qualified folks. Is that correct?
We made it available to them if they qualified. That is correct.
Yeah. How successful was that able to work out?
Well, we definitely made it available. Our first 4 homes, thanks to Kate and Habitat and her team, first 4 homes are actually on the market now. And I'm not sure if we have any of the applicants that are going through the process that are current residents from our property, but it definitely is information that we put in front of them. Due to the Fair Housing Act, there's only so much we can do in regard to getting those homes in front of our own residents and ensuring that some of them do buy them. But we did make it available and we marketed it to them aggressively.
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. And I know when we met a while back, I'd mentioned that perhaps you could come to council at a regular meeting and just present every once in a while so the public can hear what the housing or what the South Metro Housing is actually doing, because they don't know. All they think is something that's probably not what you're doing. So I think it would be favorable if you could come to our occasional meeting and do a 10-minute presentation just to let us know how things are going and what you're working on. So thank you very much, Yvonne. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you.
Councilmember Barr, you're up.
Thanks again for your presentation, Molly, and to the task force for putting together what is, it's quite a broad swath of things for us to consider on a policy level, and I think we're going to have a lot to chew on in our planning. One thing that I think it may seem tangential, but is actually intrinsically related to us as council members being able to work with the community to discuss some of these policy options with regards to whether it be changes in zoning, types of development, the incentive structures. A lot of this is actually, or I feel is going to end up being related to transportation and traffic, as was, a lot of the discussion around the Aspen Grove development. And I feel that it's not like we put cart before horse on some of these other major projects with regards to traffic studies and management, but in considering the ramifications of some of these policy outcomes, I would ask that, that the task force and your firm, when conducting some of these studies and looking at some of the potential impacts, deeply consider and work with the city with regards to traffic and transportation, because I think when it comes to us advocating for these policies, it is tends to be the number one concern of our residents.
Yeah, I think that I'll just say, I think that makes perfect sense. And that's certainly something, you know, I think where that comes up, particularly in a policy, is around whether or not we're offering parking or you want to offer parking reductions and to what extent, because that tends to get some backlash. You know, if we say, oh, you don't have to do any parking, the reality is developers are not going to build developments without parking because they don't think they can rent them or sell them without parking. But I do think it's important to point out that that's a key issue, not just parking itself, but also transportation, in commuting, out commuting. All of those things start to become really dynamic when we start talking about even just supply and demand and housing development. So point taken for sure.
Again, Yvonne and I, again, with the Housing Authority, Stephen, that's a great point. And, you know, one other thing to add to that is I think the consideration of TOD, transit-oriented development, because, you know, as we develop closer to light rail stations, things like that, the need for parking and the impact of traffic is very different.
Let's see, Councilmember Milliman.
Hey, Molly, I have two questions. The first one is with the new House Bill 1117, how many cities across the state are taking advantage of this? I mean, just a ballpark figure, or what have you heard on the street?
Great question. I wish I had a perfect answer. I can tell you there are, I would say probably 4 or 5 metro communities that I know are looking at it. The city of Denver is moving forward. They've been waiting for it and basically ready to unveil policy. So the city of Denver is moving really fast toward it. City of Longmont actually sort of passed a questionably legal inclusionary policy before 1117 was passed. They're moving forward with that. And Broomfield is also moving forward with one. And then there's a couple other cities that we've talked to in part through some of the DRCOG forums that are just interested in trying to figure out, does this make sense? Does it not? But I'd say, you know, in the half dozen range is probably at least communities that are thinking about it.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question is, with the question on should developers be allowed to develop units off-site, how fairly common is that?
I would say, I mean, nationwide, not super common. It used to be more common. So one example, or one local example, I guess I could use, is the city of Denver used to have an inclusionary policy that only applied to for sale housing. So it was legal in that regard. It did allow an off-site development. So what happened is developers would build either a condo development or single family home development in a more desirable neighborhood. And then they would put their affordable unit requirement in a less desirable neighborhood. And so the city, it was successful in that it generated a lot of units. It was unsuccessful in that the city wanted mixed income developments and mixed income communities, and it did not achieve that because it basically said, we're putting all of our affordable developments over here. And then the housing crisis hit. And then the markets, so for example, you think about like Cherry Creek has a really different market than, for example, Green Valley Ranch. And they ended up with high foreclosures as a result of that offsite allowance. There were other things that went into that as well. So that was a little bit more of an anecdote than an answer to your question. I would say it is somewhat common, but not terribly common. And it does depend on whether you feel like, look, we just want to generate units. We don't care where they are within the city. Or if the policy goal has more to do with, we want mixed income neighborhoods and mixed income developments. And by mixed, I mean some market rate units and some capital A affordable units. If that's a policy priority, then I would say don't do an offsite requirement. If the priority really is, let's get as many affordable units as we possibly can, no matter how we get them and no matter where they are, then maybe an offsite unit makes more sense because it could open up kind of the economic viability of it to more developers. But there is a bit of a trade-off there.
Yeah, I'll be interested to what your studies say about that, but I will just circle back to Envision Littleton, our 2040 plan summary. Among Littleton's core values are passion and commitment to local history, the outdoors, being inclusive. So I would hope that feeds into whatever housing ordinance we do finally adopt, if we do adopt one, which I hope that we do. And on that vein, I will say, you know, we've been talking about this since 2017. My fellow council members, we had all this work, all of this research. It's in the comp plan, it's in Vision Littleton. Now's the time. I mean, I appreciate Pat Driscoll pushing us forward to get the tax ballot initiative on the ballot last November. Let's not, let's take those steps forward and keep moving this train forward. Okay, we've got the momentum. Let's keep moving it and not kick the can down the road, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks. Mark's got his hand up, but I would just want to add a few comments here about that. The previous, previous couple of councils have been, working hard at this and making, this a priority for the community. And we've, all of us have heard through the community that this is important to the residents, to the businesses, to, the city to be able to function, to attract employees as well. So it's something that I think is important, looking at the different kind of options there. I think all three definitely play a role in what we're looking for. Obviously, the incentive based is probably the most enticing for everyone involved, but I think having some sort of mandatory inclusionary zoning at some level of scale, of a large development. You're not going to say, someone that's building a duplex or a triplex is mandated to have 50% of those units be affordable though. So I think we got to look at how we can have a diverse set of options there that meet a broader set of goals that we have. And going back through those key considerations, I think, like you said, with some like the AMI levels, that's the target levels there need to adjust based on the level of incentive. I think obviously if we can be a little more forceful on the incentive, we should be able to have a broader range of income levels. And as we know in Littleton here, that we are a community that has a mixed income neighborhoods and mixed income communities. So I think that's real important rather than trying to be having segregatory, making different neighborhoods with people that have different backgrounds and different incomes isn't the best for everyone involved. Looking at the same furnishing as market rate units, I think that's generally important, but obviously there's ways you can find things that don't necessarily have to be the exact same, but overall I would like to try to keep them as close to the same as possible there. Yeah, I think this is built the foundation for a good discussion moving forward, and hopefully the community also talks about it. And the community has been a part of this conversation for a while with the comprehensive plan and identifying, it wasn't us saying, coming down from the hilltop saying this is what we're going to do. It's we listen to the community and say this is the need that the community has identified, and that's what the comprehensive plan was. So how do we meet the goals that the community has set for us is the important next step here. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Mark here, who's been waiting patiently.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I just want to make a comment on something that Councilmember Barr kind of raised when we talk about transportation. I think many times when we talk about the city council goals, they tend to be kind of standalone, whether they're transportation or affordable housing or even economic development. But in actuality, they're all related here. And I think when we try to step back and try to think about and answer the question of why are we taking on affordable housing? I think one of the key issues that we just need to recognize that if you don't deal with the issue, then in essence, what happens is that you have a workforce that comes in and out of the city during the course of the day. And so there's an impact to the transportation network. And we don't necessarily have the most efficient transportation network. So in my opinion, one of the reasons why we want to take on affordable housing is to help strike a balance. So we're not going to be able to kind of build all the physical improvements to, make congestion disappear in our community. And so how do you kind of strike the improvements in the transportation versus affordable housing? And again, they're all related. And so I think it's important for us to kind of recognize that and articulate that, not only among ourselves and try to figure out, again, what's the objective? How are we going to measure that? But then what's the story we tell our community? Because clearly there is and can be tension when we talk about taking affordable housing or density along some of the major corridors. Aspen Grove is a recent example of that around Santa Fe. The fact is, there's opportunity to make it much more efficient in all of these goals if you look at those kinds of strategies. And the example that we've talked about many times is Broadway itself, mixed use corridor now with a ULUC. And if we are able to develop bus rapid transit, another form of efficient transportation, and how you position affordable housing and density in that corridor around BRT, to me, is one of the best examples that we should probably be talking about for the future here. So again, I guess my point is all of this is very important. And I do hope at the retreat, we're able to kind of zero in on answering the question, why? What's the objective here?
Thanks. Let's see, does anybody else have any things to add? I just wanted to give Councilmember Grove and Mayor Pro Tem Ryden an opportunity there since I haven't heard from them. Gretchen?
Yeah, I echo many of you around this, the importance of this, working in the community mental health field. Housing is a huge barrier to the health of our community. I mean, it's directly linked. I can't work on trauma. I can't work on other things without there being some stability in housing. So I see a direct threat, not just to our workforce, but just to the mental health of our community and the resiliency, especially as we're building back in the pandemic that is not going away. I see this as being playing a critical role, and I hope that this council can get some sort of inclusionary housing ordinance passed. That's really important to me. I'm not a fan of linkage fees. I don't like the idea of being divisive like that. I think we need the mixed income properties. I think that's what the best practice is now, instead of segregating it into a different area. And I think that's worked well in many pockets in Littleton. I think that's something to sustain, and that's part of our community character. I'm also not a fan of the offsite policies either. I think I can be negotiable around the amenity piece if they don't have to look exactly like. I think when we talk about equity, it's important that we try our best to be equitable, but I'm willing to negotiate on that one in the interest of other parties to make sure we get this passed and meet the needs of our community. So thank you, Corey. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Eric, for just everything you presented today. It's so great that we're having these conversations, and I hope we can continue.
Thank you. Councilmember Grove.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. This was very comprehensive. One of my frustrations with this process, which is beginning to reduce with these kinds of presentation, is what options do we have available? And I'm looking forward to our deciding on a very strategic level what our goals are, and hope staff will provide some direction and help us to formulate those goals and objectives, and then have the task force and South Metro Housing provide us with options so that we're making the right decisions and we aren't operating in a vacuum. Oh, parking, that sounds good. Oh, density, that sounds good. An extra height, that sounds good. That somehow we come together with a program that makes sense for our community and for people that will live in this housing, as well as the people that will be their neighbors. So, and that's down the road. That's much more tactical, but it's starting to flesh out, and that is a good thing. And I'm feeling much more comfortable than just even 6 months ago about where we're going and what our options are to deal with this important issue.
Yeah, I think it's, staff and the housing task force and the consultant have done a good job of kind of laying out the big picture of doing nothing versus doing something. I think we have a majority of us here, if not all of us, I think something needs to be done, whether what the action is remains to be seen, but we have a variety of options, and I think we can have some good conversation moving forward about what the end goal actually is and what's the best for the community as a whole, and not just what's best for one neighborhood or one neighbor, but everyone in Littleton, and then also realize how that also impacts the community broader than Littleton as well. All right, if there's any other comments or discussions on this part, I think we can end this, and I know we can move over into the next and hopefully last or quick item here for the updates from the city manager and city attorney. So Mark.
Thank you, Corey, and everybody for being here tonight.
Thank you all for your
Oh,
time.
thank
It's
you.
really a great conversation, a lot of good questions, and we appreciate you guys spending your energy and focus on this.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll have some good conversations moving forward through the next weeks, months, and years.
Thank
Look
you.
forward to it.
Have a good
Thanks
night.
again.
Yeah, council, I think I just have maybe just a quick update here. I sent council just a memo here, kind of following up the conversation I had with you last week, just about the status of the organization here relative to COVID. And quite honestly, this challenge we have in just vacancy rate, combination of the two is, has gotten a little bit of alarming here, depending on which part of the organization you're looking at. And specifically now it's Public Works. And we're down to a couple of CDL drivers on a snowplow, no supervision. And so we are definitely have to reorganize here if we, in the case of a snowstorm or something, in order to get enough people on the trucks. So that's one example. It is looking a little bit better in police patrol and a few other areas there, but the overall numbers of people who are, kind of in this COVID protocol right now is roughly the same. We had 20 here a week ago, 17. We got more people calling in every day. Long story short here is that, I'm looking at probably just maintaining kind of this approach here through the balance of the month. And in essence, that means that the library museum will be open. We are looking at appointment only for the Littleton Center here. And we don't really have a lot of foot traffic that comes into the Service Center at Public Works. We are looking at virtual meetings here for all boards and commissions. We've had a couple of boards specifically ask for it because of concerns with COVID. Coupled with this here is a conversation here that we had with Tri-County Health this afternoon. And I know that Councilmember Milliman, at least she was present during that. And they've reinstituted those every 2-week meetings here just to kind of brief the policymakers here on kind of the status. And this is my quick summary, just in essence of time here, but the news is not good. And it is clearly the highest at all sorts of different levels here in the entire pandemic, especially when you look at the positivity rate. I think the good news is that the hospitalization, the percent that's open in the ICUs is relatively stable. It bounces around between 10 to 14% over the last few weeks. But the sheer number of people that are ill is definitely the highest we've seen. This is my interpretation, but I think what I'm hearing and what I'm hoping for is that by the end of the month, I'm hoping that we're going to see a reduction in the Omicron peak. And I think that I'm certainly been watching, I'm sure the rest of you have too, just nationally and across the world. Many are predicting this should drop off fairly quick. Well, that's just my interpretation. And that's why I'm hoping by the end of the month, I have better news. And by taking these steps, we also have proven here over the last 2 years that we can be pretty effective in reducing the amount of COVID exposure that we have in the organization. So we're separating staff, we're being very diligent about that. And that's just kind of a quick report, and be happy to answer any questions the council may have.
Yeah, we can remain hopeful that it'll go down, but we were also hopeful 22 months ago that we'd be back to normal, and a few months after that. Regards to the library and museum, What's the tipping point for closing it? Is it just purely a staff? If too many staff are out there, it just can't make it operate? Is there?
Right. I think that's kind of the threshold for basically for all departments, but the library isn't one example. We've had two individuals that have been out here of late. One came back, had another one go out. If we keep relatively the same, we're fine. The museum is in a relatively similar position. But if we were to double that amount, then we'd be having to look at reducing the hours or some structure like that. I think my real concern is, public works out in the in the service center, like I described, and the building and community development, that hasn't gotten any better. So I think it's just those two areas in particular that I think we've had to take some action here just to kind of manage that.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to make a comment, Mark. I think you said the ICU bed capacity right now is 10%. That's regionally. What I thought was terrifying is when they said Arapahoe County, 0% ICU bed availability, 0.
Right. Yeah. And I think we all acknowledge that, we're part of a larger metro area when it comes to hospitals. So that's clearly the data for Arapahoe County. And as Dr. Douglas said, there's opportunities to kind of help manage that. But yeah, it's not good news. It's clearly bumping against a threshold here that's very alarming. And so I think that's why we're hoping over the next 2 to 3 weeks that we do see this hopefully stabilize or even reduce. That's my hope.
All right. Anything else?
No, I'm sorry, Mayor. Nothing on my end.
Okay.
Mark, City Manager, I do have a question. This is Jerry, if you don't mind. You had sent out an email regarding the RTD light rail or railroad graffiti, and that's been an issue coming up. I know, and we discussed this several months ago, many months ago.
Almost a year.
Yeah, and so the railroad is not responding at all to us. And maybe the city attorney can mention something too, but what is it we can do? Can we bill them if we have to go in and remove it?
The short answer is no, council member. I think, you raised the issue with me almost a year ago, and we've been working this issue with the railroad ever since then. I think that's why I provided council that update today to show you some of the conversation, and it has just been extremely difficult to work within the railroad.
Right.
And they've had a lot of turnover. And then you also have to work at the same time with RTD. So you have to have both of them consent to this. So my words, I think we made a breakthrough. And I do believe that we now have somebody who can help us kind of get into the site here legally. Be honest, that's obviously the goal here. The other thing I will say is that, I did contact the governmental liaison officer here for the railroad, who covers multiple states. I just made the point, we got to get to an answer here. And I think after that contact and along with Keith's work, I think that's why the breakthrough happened personally. And so not only are we going to be able to finally get into that site and clean it up, but I do believe now we're going to have a contact where we can get in there regularly and not have to wait every 6-8 months to clean something up. I apologize, council. It's just, there's no excuse for it. It's just been a deep, deep struggle trying to get railroad approval.
Thank you, Mark.
Any other questions for Mark? All right, city attorney.
Yeah, piggybacking on some of Mark's comments, and you could certainly feel how concerned he was for the city attorney's office with this COVID stuff. I mean, it was palpable, but we're at 32% for Arapahoe County, and it's not much better in our neighboring counties such as Douglas and Adams. I guess one bright note, if I may, is the Department of Treasury released some new guidance on how ARPA funds are to be used. They gave it their final order. It may not be their final rule, but it's final enough. And what that does for the city is there was a certain calculation that the city had to do in terms of what was called revenue loss. And that particular calculation, the way that we had gone through it with preliminary instructions, said we had about $7.5 million in revenue loss. And those funds can be used a little bit more easily in terms of the expenditure of those funds when you're dealing with revenue loss than some of the other guidelines that they've called for. So when they released their new final rule last week, I think they found that a lot of counties and municipalities were having issues with kind of quantifying what that loss was. And to be quite frank, I think they got tired of answering the questions. So they just gave it a base of 10 million. So we'll be allowed going forward in the expenditure of those funds to count 10 million in revenue loss, which makes it a little easier for us to expend those funds going forward when council gives us direction on where those are to go. But that is my only update, unless Mark wants to add to that.
Other than that is great news for us and the flexibility of how to use that. Otherwise, it was going to be difficult to meet the other categories. So wonderful news.
Do you have any questions for the city attorney? I've got a question, probably both Mark and Reed here about that with ARPA. When we might see some recommendations from staff about what we're going to do with that?
Well, I think we're going to see it in kind of multiple meetings here, but going back to last year, in fact, at the CML conference, there was a couple of presentations I know a few of council and I went to, where basically the recommendation coming from the state and others was just to hang on. Don't get too much in a hurry to allocate all those funds. Well, now that we have kind of this final rule, and I have to smile a little bit because we just got a final rule on the CARES Act about a month ago, and that expenditure was supposed to be done about a year ago. So this is always interesting when it comes to this. But we are going to have a conversation with the council on the 18th of this month, and in part where it's a financial update. And I kind of commented on this a while back, but our sales tax, we want to report to council on that. You've seen some reports of late. We obviously had planned for a robust recovery for 2022. That's what the budget was planned on. And we're definitely seeing that. And we're actually exceeding that. So we're going to report on that, what it means. And so I do plan to make a proposal to council to bring back some of the services that, we had to cut as a result of COVID. Library and museum is kind of an example of what I want to discuss with council. ARPA is part of that conversation, but the larger conversation is going to be at the retreat. And then at the end of February, I want to say February 22nd. I think the retreat is an opportunity as council wrestles with their goals and gives us a little direction as staff, allow staff some more time to kind of figure out, okay, well, how are we going to finance that? So ARPA may have another role in that. And so the 22nd of February as a follow-up to the retreat is another opportunity. And then finally, I believe probably before the staff dives into the budget process for 2023, roughly the end of April, beginning of May, I'd like to come back to council and just talk again about the allocation of ARPA. Again, we have 12 million in total. I think it's about $1.5 million that we've only allocated to this point. So there are a lot of possibilities. And I think that's what we're looking at the retreat, is to start getting some of that guidance.
Thank you. Councilmember Valdez.
Thank you, Mayor. One last question for the city manager. On the census, did we finally get our final count, population count? I mean, the numbers that we had were way below what we anticipated. And so do we finally have a number? I mean, what's up? Did the federal government finally put it out?
No, I don't have a reason why. I think it's mystifying. Reed may have something to add here, but I believe it's still May before we get the final number.
May of what year?
Well, fair question, Councilor, but I think it's supposed to be this year. I mean, we've never seen anything like this happen before in the census. This is extremely unusual. I just don't have an answer other than May.
Thank you.
All right, does anyone have any other questions? Nope. All right, well, just to remind people, we'll have that ARPA discussion at a study session next week after the special meeting and executive session that we have scheduled for that. So, all right, I'm going to adjourn the study session here at 8:30. 6:37, and see everyone.